Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Baranowski. I'm the director of the Warsaw office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's a great pleasure to have distinguished speakers with us online and having you all join being on the other side of the screen. Warm welcome to the initial seminar on Chinese disinformation in Europe. We all have heard so much and watched so much focus so far being on the Russian disinformation in Europe. But because of the increasing focus, both of the EU and NATO as an alliance on China, something that will be discussed also in the process of upgrading NATO strategic concept, we thought with our partner in US mission at NATO that it's important topic to address also with the broader audience. So we are very glad to have you with us. Big thank you to the US mission to NATO for working and partnering with us on this project. Besides this one, this seminar, where we are looking at Europe, but probably focusing a little bit more on the eastern flank of the alliance, we'll also contact you all for our subsequent 2 seminars that are part of this project. But now, without any further ado, let me pass it on to my colleague, Marika, fellow at GMF, who's going to moderate our debate. Marika, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for the kind introduction. My name is Mareike Uhlberg, and I'm a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, based at the Berlin office, and I'll be moderating today. So I think most of us have probably started paying attention to disinformation as well as information operations coming from China, whereas in the past, the focus in Europe was always, as Michael has already said, more heavily on Europe. But with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have really seen a stark increase in information operations and straight out disinformation coming from China, with intensified messaging around pandemic management, pandemic origins, vaccine diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. And in many cases, those narratives coming from China are in direct opposition to the narratives put out in European nations by NATO, by the EU. We've also seen a lot of disinformation that is directly targeted at the legitimacy of democratic systems of government. So this is really becoming quite relevant. So today I'm extremely delighted that we'll be able to talk about the footprint of the Chinese presence in some Central and Eastern European states, with a very good panel that we have here. I will briefly introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Mr. Janis Sartz. He is the director of the NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence in Riga, which is, as most of you will probably know, a multinational cross-sector organization providing analysis, advice, and practical support in strategic communications to the alliance and allied nations. He was also a state secretary in the Ministry of Defense, and he has also led the Latvian government's efforts to increase its security and defense in cyberspace. As a second speaker, we have Alicia Bachulska, who is a map-influenced China analyst in Poland and a member of the China Observers Network in Central and Eastern Europe. Also, the abbreviation is CHOICE. She also works as a China analyst at the Asia Research Center at the War Studies University in Warsaw, and she is a PhD candidate at the Graduate School for Social Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences. And last but not least, we have Dr. Regis Rinis, who is the director of the National Cybersecurity Center at the Ministry of Defense of Lithuania. He has more than a decade of experience in the field on both the national and the international level. And Dr. Rinis has been part of multiple international working groups and is a founder of a Center for Cyber Incident Management in Lithuania. So just a couple of words of housekeeping. We will start with brief inputs from each of the panelists. While this is happening, please feel free to start submitting your questions via the Q&A function. And then after an initial discussion, we will get to your questions. Now, without further ado, let us get started. And I would first like to give the word to Janis Sartz, and if you could give a brief input of what you have been seeing in terms of information operations and disinformation originating from China. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marike, and such a pleasure to participate on this panel and share some of the findings we have sent on Chinese recent operations. But first, as a disclaimer, what I'll be addressing is the information operations and disinformation, not more traditional influence operations or cyber operations by China, which I think is a big subject on their own right that might be covered in different panels, clearly. But what we've seen very simply is very steep increase of a Chinese disinformation in Europe at large, and also partly also in Central and Eastern Europe. But of course, there are strong variables how that works and how it has functioned. And I would probably start with kind of first point, and you Marike, also pointed out to the pandemic as one of the thresholds, not threshold, the watershed moment of this Chinese arrival, disinformation proper arrival in Europe. And that is the way we also saw it, especially in the very first months of the pandemic, the origins of the virus, as well as questioning the Europe's ability to deal with that was clearly very much focus of the Chinese authorities. And we could see that there was a lot of kind of, I'd say, tactically applying, I would say, the methodology they might have been using in a kind of near neighborhood of China, which is much more kind of brutal than we would have been used in Europe. So, which I think up to that point, I would say, use the allegory. They would operating with a soft gloves and getting people kind of nicely accustomed to what China would be interested in, and suddenly kind of dropping these gloves and really going into the fist fight, trying to bloody the nose. And in some cases, actually, they did somewhat. But I would argue what we saw was, and that's why I delineated from the pure influence operations and the cyber operations, I was surprised they were not really that good. And I would give you a few reasons that we saw that. First, they operated as they are used to operate. But to be successful with these information operations, you really have to understand the audience. So I think they did not really understand the audience or didn't really care to understand the audience. But it struck me that much of their activity was, in fact, counterproductive. The type and way it was done, it was very brutal. It was kind of almost inviting the strong pushback. And in some cases, actually, the way it was done, I think, was very clearly, putting the ones that were addressed and targeted in a clear position that they had to really respond strongly. So really, I didn't find they were really understanding the audience. And we can dispute later why was that the case. Second thing, especially in the early cases, we found they lacked disinformation infrastructure. And I come from the institution that really kind of has followed the Russian operation for years. And one thing that really struck how much they relied on the official accounts in disseminating their narrative, and also kind of disinformation, sometimes some conspiracy related theories, and et cetera, et cetera. And, at this point where Europe has faced disinformation waves after the wave, that was kind of, I'd say, lame, because it was very easy to attribute and clearly kind of point to the culprits and therefore understand their reasons for doing so. Of course, things have not been static. they have evolved, and this last piece, I would argue, is really kind of changing. And what we see really is the creation of that disinformation infrastructure. But then still, if I compare it to Russia, it's still quite a strong distance away from what we've seen the Russian operation is capable of. So in a way, yes, they are, but also when we recently mapped out some of their activity, they still kind of rely on very centralized approach to these things. So you would always kind of have the first nodes of that always be at some official account level. And sometimes even it seems that you can kind of follow the government's area of responsibilities. This part of the government is responsible here, therefore this account would be the one that is showing the marching orders, and then the infrastructure starts to kind of amplify and go in a specific direction, or the different agency in some other cases where other issues are involved. So it's actually also, when you compare to the Russian operation, easier to track at this point in time, and also the kind of level of ability to use this infrastructure is not quite, you know, sophisticated, I would argue, with that. And of course, I'm also here, if we go now more regional, it's very much also we have to delineate their ability to address the Chinese community, which is, I think, a very different ballgame, where they have much more ability to really go into the audience and the way they think and give them the information and the narrative, as well as, in many cases, the perspectives of the world as they wish to do so. So in a way, sometimes we could see that the level of effectiveness of their operation is also quite dependent on the scope of the Chinese diaspora in a given country. Also, I think when we think about the effects of what we've been seeing over the last 1.5 years, has actually been bad for China. I think that has really been counterproductive, because you measure the kind of public perception of China in most of the countries, not all, of course, but most of the countries, it has really deteriorated. And therefore, I say that they still are skillful in other areas, but this information piece didn't strike me as something that was really overly effective compared to other operations we've seen. But not to paint a too rosy picture, I think what we really have to also understand is China has been really good at using different kinds of leverages. And of course, when we think about the leverages, one of the areas we have to really consider is that much of this interaction happens in the digital space. And although we've been used to having much of that space governed by the Western companies, Facebooks, Googles, Twitters, etc., this area is coming to an end. And of course, that is where we have to really consider, because when we think about the application of the emerging technologies to the pushing of disinformation and influence operations in information space, there are many new possibilities evolving down the road. And that is where I'd be really kind of worried about what potentially China can do and have a potential advantages, technological advantages, in particular getting access to the huge data sets on our people and our population kind of behaviors, etc., that of course inevitably would lead to the ability to very clearly micro-target people for their opinions and shift of these opinions. But of course, it's not yet there. It's over, course of I'd say 3-5 years that we'll see the emergence of that. Although I would be arguing that is why, we have to take more holistic approach and that is like not say, okay, they have not been good at information operations, therefore we can be at ease. We have to combine that with their cyber operation, their traditional influence operations, especially in the economic area, using economic leverages, and also kind of create a comprehensive response system, and understand that some areas like cyber, if neglected, would immediately have down the road effects on the information space and our ability to deal with the China's perpetrated disinformation. With that, thank you very much. These were my points.
Thank you very much for your input. I think you made a couple of really important points. That is not to over exaggerate the current effectiveness of information operations coming out of China, which is frankly also what I see and what I think is in part due to the fact that they are quite good at doing these operations in China itself, but China functions according to very different rules. So it takes a lot of time to adapt that closed information environment operations to another mode where you have an open information environment. But I fully agree that we shouldn't also be dismissive of it simply because of this, because there are a lot of avenues here. Now, there's lots of things that I think I want to pick up later during the discussion, but first we will go to Alicia Bachulska. Could you tell us what you're seeing in Poland and also how you approach disinformation and information operations? How do you view these? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be able to be here with you today. So I will also start with a little disclaimer before I dive into details. And I would like to briefly touch upon the key concept that we're actually talking about today, that is Chinese disinformation and information operations. And I think that it's actually quite crucial to try to establish some kind of boundaries between these concepts, because if we don't do so, I'm afraid that on the one hand, we might actually end up inflating certain narratives or certain trends, while on the other hand, we might actually not gain that many insights into what, how, and why China is doing here on the ground. So if we assume that disinformation is the deliberate spread of false, fake information to influence others, then I would say that actually here in Poland, we haven't witnessed that many cases of it originating from China. This is, of course, debatable depending on the definition, but from my perspective, I feel like what we have been actually witnessing in the last decade, and especially in the last 2 to 3 years after the pandemic started, is China's ongoing attempts to influence the local debate on China and also on the CCP itself, by trying to promote Beijing's favorite interpretations of its own policies, and also a set of slogans that Xi Jinping has been streamlining in the last couple of years, both domestically and internationally, such as win-win cooperation, community of shared destiny, the whole narrative of China being a benign power, which is not interfering in other countries' internal affairs, and the list goes on, it's very long. But overall, all these elements have somehow fallen under the category of what the Chinese government and the CCP call spreading the positive energy. So it's basically more about highlighting the positive elements of China's engagement, China's rise and cooperation with China, while at the same time trying to silence or sideline voices critical of Beijing and the government in Beijing. So here, going back to what I mentioned in the beginning, I would say that what we have witnessed in Poland is a steady development of propaganda-based information operations that are trying to nurture in the long term a China-friendly environment, both at the level of the Polish society and some local elites. But these information operations, so far, they did not really have a coercive angle to them. or at least we do not have enough evidence to prove that China has been engaging in this kind of coordinated, coercive behavior on the Polish soil. However, I would still say that, yes, it is not that serious. Although it's not that serious at this moment, it does not mean that this kind of behavior should be neglected, as it on its own, it has this coercive potential that is somehow detrimental to the overall shape of the Polish public debate and how different aspects of China's development and growing influence are actually debated here on the ground. But when it comes to the specifics in Poland, when it comes to China's behavior, I would say that before the pandemic, there was quite a lot of focus on building people-to-people ties and people-to-people cooperation, for example, among journalists, which from a perspective of, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years, seems like an attempt to create a network of institutions, or at least people in certain institutions who would then might be willing to create and disseminate more China-friendly coverage. And for example, 2017 was officially labeled as the year of media cooperation of the 1617+1 cooperation platform, which translated into an increase in bilateral and multilateral cooperation between local journalists. A couple of different content sharing agreements were signed between local organizations and the Xinhua News Agency. And also a lot of journalists participated in events organized either by the embassy or traveled to China on tours that were aimed at, just fostering these bilateral relations, without obviously really highlighting the differences in the work environments these journalists in Poland and in China work in, and what kind of implications they have also in terms of nature of the political regimes these journalists operate within. And as Mr. Sartz said, I believe that the breakthrough event was the pandemic, but also right before the pandemic, in 2019, when the Hong Kong protests happened, there was an upsurge of articles and op-eds in different CE countries that were really pushing a very similar narrative and arguments related to the Hong Kong protests. Some of them were written by the embassy staff, but some of them were also somehow, they didn't have an author, but they were pushing very similar arguments about the alleged unlawful and violent behavior of the protesters. And from my perspective, this might have been the first case of what now seems like a coordinated effort in the whole region to somehow promote one certain perspective on what has been happening in Hong Kong, and obviously here the perspective of the government in Beijing. Also in Poland, what is quite peculiar is the impact of very close ties between Warsaw and Washington on how the Chinese side is trying to promote its own standpoint. And this was very visible at the very beginning of the pandemic when the Chinese ambassador and the American ambassador to Poland engaged in a public debate questioning each other country's reactions to the pandemic. And it started, I think, with an op-ed by the American ambassador, who published this article criticizing China's response in March or maybe February 2020. And then the Chinese ambassador responded with another article. And then the discussion moved to Twitter, where it lasted for many, many weeks and attracted a lot of engagement. But actually, this kind of engagement and the profiles that were interacting with the content produced by the Chinese ambassador and the embassy were seemingly generated by bots, because of the very strange language they were using, broken Polish, very poorly edited Polish and English. And also most of these accounts that were promoting the narrative, the official Beijing narrative, were established in the same month that the whole debate started, which was March, I think, 2020. And also, they did not have any previous history of interactions with other profiles or Twitter accounts, which does suggest that these were not genuine users. And I would say that this history, this story, is probably the closest what we can get when it comes to something similar to a coordinated effort to actually disinform the public in the context of the Sino-American rivalry and its impact here on the ground.
Thank you so much. I think you raise a lot of really important points, and including, of course, the building up of networks of people. I guess what's either called borrowing a boat to sail to the sea, or I've also seen the expression borrowing a mouth to speak, to simply use locals to make the points that the Chinese government wants to make, which I think is probably a fairly good approach if done correctly. You also raise the point of bot networks that were already in the previous intervention. I think we should get back to that in our discussion, because there is some really interesting stuff happening there, even though I fully agree that in most European languages, they're not very sophisticated at all right now. But for now, I want to move on to Dr. Regis Rinis, who can give us, now that we've heard a perspective from Poland, where really the narratives have been, by and large, with a few exceptions, fairly constructive, long-term oriented, perhaps give a little bit of a perspective from Lithuania, where I think with the most recent conflict between the PRC and Lithuania, we might have actually seen a quite more aggressive tone in information operations. So Dr. Rinis, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, my intervention will be related more on cybersecurity issues, as that is my field of work that we do in the National Cybersecurity Center, which is in my country the centralized approach for dealing with cybersecurity issues and with the cybersecurity attacks, including cybersecurity attacks that are state-sponsored. And yes, we previously had most of them related to the Russian Federation state-sponsored attacks, and now we are facing with the increase of China-sponsored attacks. Why it is important to this topic of the discussion is that usually we are seeing the hybrid type of the attack when information campaigns combine it with cyber attacks. As an illustration, I would like to give the media websites or media information systems hack, leaving the backdoors, so-called special software, malicious code, which allows to make connections in day X when it's necessary. That's called backdoors. Left the ability to connect and put usually fake news in relation to the particular dates and events. That one side. Other sides, I would like to share a few slides, if you will allow, as there will be a technical information. So I guess it will be good to illustrate that with a couple of slides. So that's a list of services we do as a National Cybersecurity Center. And the most important in that relation is that we do have a research and development division. So a bunch of smart guys, IT guys, that can perform really deep technical investigation because sometimes we are saying that some of the states are having tools, technical tools to perform the information attacks, spying activities, and so on. And to come with the evidence of that activity, we need a research, a deep technical investigation. So we have the ability to do that. We have equipments, we have special methodology that we developed, and with the research we do, when we come to the conclusions and reports, we usually sharing the metrics, the methodology, how we do that. Why? To answer the question that anything else could repeat the research we did and should came with the same conclusion. So that's academic principles that applied around the world. We started a couple of years ago with Chinese IP cameras. And why with those? In European market, those companies as Hikvision are having approximately 40% of the market. So those devices is spread around our networks, not only home and enterprises, but as well as critical infrastructures. And with the investigation of those cameras, we came with the conclusions and important vulnerabilities from the security point of view that allows to control those camera hacking, easily actually hacking. The main conclusion was that those cameras from China are purely from the technical sides developed, how to say, the quality to say simpler, it's the quality is low, which means that it allows a lot of vulnerability to be used. And now the main point, recently, a couple of months ago, we performed a large research of most popular Chinese smartphone devices. And we selected the smartphone devices that do use 5G technology, which means this is the most modern spreading in our society's devices that do apply the 5G, the most modern GSM technology. Why we took those devices? Because there is a lot of complaints about the vulnerabilities in the public databases of the vulnerabilities. We can find a lot of time that those devices are mentioning. We did the investigation. It took 3 months to disassemble those devices and do reverse engineering technique to came to the certain conclusions. At least 4 of them is important from the security point of view. That we know, for example, as devices as Huawei are not getting Google licensing to use Google app application store, so they developed their own application store. We randomly selected applications from that store, and we came to the conclusion that at least 3 of those applications do have the malware. When users install the application as messaging application, the malware they install as well, which allows to control those devices. Other data privacy lost when most of the at least 61 parameters from the device that do includes personal data is collected from those devices and sent to the clouds servers that are located in Singapore. But the most interesting, perhaps, for this discussion topic is the Xiaomi devices that we found that do have content filtering functionality inside it. So we found a special block list, as it call it in the devices directly. It's a block list of certain content that are related to at least more than 400 keywords. And the most interesting thing that majority of those keywords are related to the religion groups, political movements, social movements, democracy, Tiananmen Square, and things like that. Important to notice that this functionality is not active for the devices that is in European region. So it correlates with the GPS location. If the device that is activated in Europe, device downloads the block list, but it's not active, but it downloads it. That's why it's allowed us to investigate and find the conclusions. When we published that report in English, it's deep, more than 30 pages, technical report with all the evidence and technical information that hard to to say no to them. And after the 1 week time, the block list was modified, including more than 1,000 keywords, that it was adopted to block the advertisements and as well sexual content on those devices. Last but not least, 2 weeks ago, finally, we spotted that the block list to European region came empty at the end. So what I want to say, the key message, my key message would be that this efforts in doing this kind of the researches looks like is influencing China manufacturers to take actions. Even publicly, they said that everything what is in report is not true, but behind the scenes, they are adjusting technical things and adopting to the situation, to the current situation. So this key message is that we can influence China and to change the habits, which is a very important thing to do. And we are planning to prolong this kind of the technical investigation and research to come with the conclusions on other important devices that our society use, and could be that those devices could be used for a China interest. Yeah. So with that, I would like to conclude my words. Over to you, Marika.
Thank you very much. I think it should be, by the end, it should have been fairly clear how all of this is tied into the broader theme of disinformation and information operations, because even though such block lists are not activated, they do speak to a potential of censoring information and excluding certain information at a different level. So I think to anybody who hasn't checked out this report, I think the link was in there, but I think it's a really important one to look at what is already in some of the software, not just in terms of vulnerabilities, but also in terms of these capabilities to do this, which of course speaks to some of the methods that are used in a Chinese context to keep a lid on the information environment, which works a lot with manipulating the actual technology and how that is used. And even though we're not seeing it here, it's incredibly important to keep an eye on that. I do have a couple of questions, maybe to the extent that you can speak to it later on, whether you did see any changes in terms of other operations in recent weeks, but let's perhaps go back to the whole panel first, and ask a general question, and that is what is the most what is the most harm of what you have seen so far that has been done? What are the problems with what we have been seeing, and to what extent do we need to be careful not to exaggerate what we're seeing, while at the same time taking it seriously what we are seeing? If any of you want to address that point.
Well, I would take probably a stab at it first. I think the biggest harm I've seen were, and as you might have heard, I was somewhat dismissive on the kind of overall effects of it. But what really worries me, this information piece, is how these Chinese efforts, especially saying you cannot talk like that about China, and point it at individual journalists and et cetera, is actually the effect on the values and freedoms we have in our own society. And that some people would choose not really kind of investigate it, or bother about things, etc. And I'd argue at this point, I've seen this as the biggest potential harm. In a way, also, I think it has also created some of the biggest backlash, kind of pointing out individuals and saying you should never do that because you know nothing of China and we are only the ones that can control the narrative. But I think that is what is the danger today, as I've said and I pointed out, and also to what Ritis said. I think there are also a lot of technological related risks, especially down the road, as we are going to be using more of their technology in our everyday life, and their ability of framing the scape, the kind of environment where we kind of do the information is going to have a profound potential effects on many things. So that's it for me.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the willingness to censor on behalf of the Chinese government is indeed one of the more important points that has a lot to do with how this is handled in Europe. I mean, a lot in the audience might remember the case of LinkedIn, which I think now has announced it's pulling out of China, but for I think years, LinkedIn was actually censoring the profiles of people, at least as they were displayed in China, if they contained sensitive keywords, and LinkedIn was actively reaching out to users and encouraging essentially to modify their own profiles if they wanted to continue being visible globally. So to a large extent, I really think a lot of this comes down to how this is handled on the European side, including by corporations, but also by individuals, et cetera. Do either of the other two panelists, do you have anything to add? Yes, Alicia, please go ahead.
Yes, I would just like to add that I feel like one of the harms that can be possibly done in the future is that if you combine low levels of China literacy here in the region, because given the fact that, for example, area studies are quite underdeveloped in Poland and I guess also in other CE states, and the expert community is also relatively small. And if you combine that with a quite high exposure to content created by Chinese state-affiliated media, it might, in the long run, translate into a threat coming from somehow normalizing these talking points and the position of the Chinese government. It does not have to happen this way, but still I feel like this is something that we should be really aware of. But on the other hand, if we want to measure the efficiency of this kind of efforts so far, one thing is that we can see that there is a certain strategy behind what Chinese diplomats and media have been doing here. as I've already mentioned, establishment of these networks, cooperation, official agreements, and so on. But then if you look at the actual content, its form, its lack of originality, the newspeak used, especially in countries that have a very vivid memory and of history of authoritarian governance, this kind of an approach seems very counterproductive. And if we look at the data and all the latest research and surveys that clearly show that the public opinion on China here in Poland and other CE states have been steadily deteriorating, we might actually see that China still has to do a lot of work if it really wants to influencing the local public opinion more broadly. And one more element that we have to bear in mind is that a lot of this behavior is not necessarily directly targeting the local audience, but is actually aimed at proving to the central government in Beijing that these diplomats and these journalists, Chinese journalists here on the ground, are doing their job. So they are not really judged against the effects of their work, but rather whether they have fulfilled their duties in the broader context of the rise of warrior diplomacy and Beijing's more assertive stance. So it's rather about repeating certain messages that don't necessarily have to please or interest local audiences in order for these representatives of the Chinese party state to be then better assessed within China. And one of the, let's say, proofs of this kind of an argumentation is that the former Chinese ambassador to Poland, who was very active in what I've described in my previous intervention about his public months-long debate with the Chinese ambassador, has recently been promoted in May this year to the position of the Chinese Foreign Ministry's commissioner in Hong Kong, which is, I would say, quite a big promotion and some showcasing evidence that his approach was actually valued in Beijing because of the promotion.
Thank you. We are getting a lot of good questions from the audience, so I wanna get to those soon, but I think you make some really important points. One which is kind of my pet peeve, that I think in many ways in Central and Eastern Europe, a lot of this messaging actually isn't very well received at all, despite some of the narratives that, I mean, I'm German, that for instance, Germany would like to push that this is mainly a Central and Eastern European problem. I don't see it that way at all. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that there's a recent history that actually helps defend against also the question of who the target audience is and the difficult balance of, officially speaking to foreigners, but of course also having to make your bosses in Beijing happy. Now, I do want to get to the questions, and there's and that is, do you think that we've witnessed or we've been witnesses of Chinese-Russian cooperation in information operations? And I guess I would extend that question and ask, to what extent have you seen perhaps China starting to learn, or any evidence of China starting to learn from Russian disinformation operations? Is anything happening on that front? Or is that more of a, so far more of a, let's say, future potential?
Well, if I may here, I think that's a quite frequently asked question. And clearly, what we see, there is probably some copy-paste or copycat elements in there, but there's no data that we've seen or come across that there is a coordination of that activity. And in a way, it would strike me as not something that is very likely to happen. At least in a near term, and I would argue that we probably would have some, especially like we talked about the botnet and this online stuff. I'd say China is like 5-6 years behind Russia in that activity, yes, they can adapt and speed up, but I think there is one pretty major difference in these two operations, why they can't really be that much kind of compared. Russia is running very much a network-centric approach of disinformation, and sometimes, therefore, it's very hard to find an attribute. For China, it's very vertical, in a sense, as I've said, and as the person that has lived 18 years in an aspiring communist country, I'd say when I read the research on China, so much flashbacks coming back. And I think that is also kind of one of the problems they run into, as you just pointed anecdotally. It's always much more useful to be seen nicely by Beijing than having real effectiveness on the ground. And I think that's kind of the thing, is what will be preventing China to be overly effective in this area.
Thank you. Anything to add?
If I may add just a couple of words, I agree with Mr. Sartz that this is a question that everybody keeps asking in the last couple of years, and everybody wants to get an answer. So far, at the official level, there has been a number of different cooperation agreements signed between Chinese and Russian outlets on content sharing and so on, but this does not necessarily mean that this is a coordinated approach. But some preliminary research of Map Influence project in Czechia noticed that certain alternative media outlets in Czechia are spreading both Russia-friendly content, and also began recently to regularly publish pieces by Chinese diplomats. But again, this does not mean that this is a coordinated approach. This might be a recycling of certain propaganda content, but it's something to look out for in the future.
Thanks. We have more questions coming in. One is, given the clearly negative reactions in most of Europe to what China has done in the information and cyber realm over the last year and a half, can you comment on Beijing's ability to adapt its tactics, techniques, and procedures? And importantly, can you say what may be coming in the next wave, so to speak? And I also want to bring Regis Rinis back in to see if you have any comments on that. But of course, either of the other two panelists are free to answer as well.
Yeah, okay. I would answer to the question, yes, of course. When we analyze in cybersecurity domain the abilities of China, we counted 97 APT groups that are right now active in cybersecurity in the electronic world. So it's a lot. So we can imagine abilities are very, very big, and those abilities are ready to be used in various campaigns. Usually we see that most of those activities and attacks are hidden because the main purpose we see right now is the spying activities and intellectual information steal. So they try to be into the system and steal information as much as possible for how long it's possible. I mean, the longer the better. So visibility is not the target. But when they will decide to do visibility campaigns, when we'll try to use cyber attacks with the purpose, with the target to spread the fake news, the information, things like that, I see a big challenge, really big challenge. And the abilities, as I said, perhaps even are bigger than the Russian Federation at the moment. So that's definitely we should be afraid of and prepare our defense systems and reaction to that immediately, because it's a matter of time will it happen. That's my view on that.
Thanks. Any other thoughts from Janis? Or yeah, Janis, please go ahead.
Well, just quickly, as I've said, clearly they've started from a slow start, and in a way that has been counterproductive. They will always have a reason to kind of self-reflect, and in a sense of resources, they should have all the necessary elements to be able to do much more damage than they've done so far. The question I have is, does the system really support being able to work effectively in the European information space? And that's where I don't have an answer yet, because as I've said, what I've seen as a glimpses is kind of where importance, how you've seen back home, is much more important than the actual delivery. So this allegedly meritocratic system of China has kind of gone too communist, if I might put it this way. But of course, that's not something that can't change. If it changes, then of course there are many venues that they can take, and I'd say at this point in time, with the soft glows, they were so much more successful than they are without them, and going into the kind of much more brutal exchange.
Thanks. We have another question, and this is actually one that I'm also really interested in personally to hear from all of you, from Fredrik Foy at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agencies. And you've been talking, about the indications in certain Western countries that the PRC seeks to increase the use of proxies to bridge the lack of target audience analyses. And there, you have the traditional ones such as friendship associations and other sympathizers, which were, I think, briefly touched upon with the journalist network, at least. But more recently, we've also seen actually Western influencers on social media, as well as Western PR agencies becoming active on behalf of the Chinese government. So the question is whether any of you have noticed such practices in the Baltic states or in CEE countries, or any other ways that are comparable to this use of influencers that might be able to reach target audiences better.
If I may, I have a few points. First of all, there has been some cases of influencers, bloggers, YouTubers who have been producing content that might be considered China friendly. That means if you look at the broader context of what kind of things they have been producing over time, you would notice that all the topics that these people touch upon are unproblematic to the CCP. And also some of the content produced by this kind of China-friendly influencers has been done, for example, not directly in cooperation with the embassy, but you can see that these people, for example, attend parties at the Chinese embassy, and there are clearly some links between them and the officials. But whether this is a big phenomenon in Poland, no, it is not. It is a tiny niche. And there's also internal debate whether this kind of content is actually desirable or not. Another interesting point when it comes to proxies is that when it comes to media ownership, Polish law is already quite strict when it comes to acquisitions by foreign capital. So the threat of, let's say, Chinese capital buying local media is basically non-existent. But instead, what we have witnessed is that we have, for example, one publishing house which has been bought by Chinese entity, and it has specialized in publishing mostly China-related books, which are all in line with the official narrative of the government in Beijing. So publishing the books on Xi Jinping's thought, or publishing all kind of classics, let's say, that are promoting the official standpoint of the government. These are not bestsellers. but nevertheless, you can find them in local bookshops. So there is a niche for this kind of products. But yet again, it's very hard to measure how many people read them and whether they are really having any impact on how this public debate on China is developing.
Thank you. Janis, you have something to add?
Yeah, well, just to support what Alicia said is that I think we can say that, well, we've seen these kind of proxies, but they've been used for the cases where it's, I think, totally legitimate. That's how many countries use the local players to spread a particular image, to promote the image. So I haven't seen them really kind of embarking in talking about the Hong Kong protests like in a particular way, or anything that is really kind of about even politically sensitive, not to mention disinformation outright. So I think at this point, when it is seen, it is what you can call as a legitimate use of trying to spread their point of view or kind of image of a country.
Thanks. Yeah, this actually is a perfect segue to the next question, which is precisely this: where do you draw the line between legitimate diplomacy and influence operations or disinformation operations? Where is the line, and what does that mean for how we need to actually deal with this?
Pretty simple. Disinformation is something that has been on where the actor in question has purposefully kind of either amended facts, created new facts, or any kind of interpretation of facts for a specific effect on the audience, with the coordinated use of multiple sources to create these effects. And I think where I would certainly draw the line is, one thing is where you kind of promote your image or the narrative, where you can arguably see, well, you might disagree with the narrative and sometimes the values as well, but you know, that's a global world. We have to listen to each other. So there's nothing in per se bad, but really kind of create an effect on an audience by using the misplaced facts or created facts or conspiracy theories. And that's what I've said, for me, that this watershed moment was the pandemic when it started. It really started not that much from Central Eastern Europe, but in Europe at large. Yes, I think it started. And second, of course, is when the actor is trying to kind of follow their own value system and try to imprint it on other country, saying, you know, well, I like the way you allow me to talk my point of view, but you don't have a right to talk about your point of view about me, which is effectively what many of the official voices of China have said. And I think also that is something they can say that, but they can't really try to implement it versus the journalists, the public figures, and etc. And that's another line I think that has to be drawn, where I would say that's something that we shouldn't be allowed.
One more thing that I think is not that self-evident at first, but that also have some kind of implications is the question of reciprocity. So if, as an intellectual kind of exercise, if we turn the tables and tried to, if the European diplomats or different representatives of European states tried to behave in the same way that the Chinese diplomats are behaving here in Europe, this would, I mean, first of all, it would never happen. We would never hear about it. And then secondly, if there were some cases in the past that this kind of veiled criticism was actually happening in China by Western diplomats, this would be outrightly labeled by the central government as, you know, spreading false information. which, you know, in a certain way, from the Chinese perspective, what the Western governments are doing is disinformation. So then, if we think about it from this perspective, any kind of pressure, diplomatic pressure, or any attempts to limit the local debate on China, in a large scheme of things, and given the authoritarian regime of the Chinese state, can be considered disinformation. But again, this is, you know, this is more of an intellectual exercise. But in general, I would agree with what Mr. Sartz said, that we have to be able to pinpoint that certain narratives are spread intentionally with the purpose of manipulating or changing the public opinion so that it's more in line with the interest of another actor.
Yeah, thanks. I think the question of reciprocity with China in this case is, of course, a huge one, and one where there's never going to be full reciprocity. I recall this case where I think the European ambassadors to China tried to publish an op-ed in the China Daily, which is an English language paper, so it doesn't even reach Chinese audiences. And they basically essentially had to censor themselves and had to take parts out in order to get that very mild piece into the not even Chinese speaking press. Whereas, of course, all Chinese ambassadors based in Europe publish op-eds on a really regular basis with all, I think that's true for pretty much all countries. And clearly we're not even close to any kind of reciprocity there, similar for access to social media, of course, and all these other fields. Before we move on the list of questions from the audience, I do want to ask a related follow-up question to Regis, and that is, in your presentation, you know, you pointed out some of the issues with the technology, and two questions there. One is how can you distinguish between sloppy and intentional? I think I would assume in some cases that's easier than in others, because this has also been a big debate with Huawei in Europe, of course. Where do you draw the line between this just sloppiness or this is maybe intentionally or problematic? Can you establish intent with any of these vulnerabilities? And then the other question, what in this area would be legitimate and what would be clearly illegitimate in terms of some of these softwares pre-installed on these devices?
Yeah, from cybersecurity point of view, there's hard to draw a red line. Is mostly considered that cybersecurity attacks is a gray area, yeah, and it's why those regimes, China and Russian federations, do perform a lot of activities, because it's hard and almost impossible to draw a red line. Why? Because cybersecurity in the internet is easily to hide the activities, to guarantee the anonymity, to use cybercrime as a coverage for attacks. That's one thing. The other answer to the other question, and it's why it's important to do research and to raise legitimate questions. And we hardly can raise a question and expect Chinese answer to the questions if we do not have evidence, if we have just an opinion, what is right and what is wrong in our understanding. And our understanding, of course, is not the same as Chinese understanding, but facts and technical information speak with itself. Yes, and when we do that, and when we rise and we say that we as a customers of those Chinese devices want to have answers to this and that, then we can expect an example shows that companies, enterprises, and behind those enterprises of China, there is a China government. They coordinate and answer and to react to that. And when they react, we can use that information to adapt to our needs to build our defense systems. That's, I hope I answered with that question.
Thank you. Yeah, to the extent that the question can be answered, of course.
You're right.
True for all of the aspects that we're covering here. We do have more questions, and one is from Ian Bond from the Center for European Reform, who writes, I heard a lot from the speakers about undesirable Chinese information campaigns, but not much about disinformation as such of the kind used by Russia. And we already addressed that to some extent. Are there concrete examples of China spreading false information, for instance, with a view to exacerbating polarization in society, to undermine Western government positions on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, etc., or to drive wedges between the US and European allies? So what have you seen in terms of concrete, actual disinformation campaigns?
I think that one of the best examples, which is applicable to both Poland and Czechia also, is China Radio International, CRI, which is broadcasting in local languages, in Czech and in Polish. But in the last, I would say maybe 5 years, most of their activities have moved to Facebook. And first of all, the interesting thing is that, for example, in Czechia, the official account on Facebook of China Radio International has almost 1 million followers, which in a country of around a little bit more than 10 million people, this is, you know, I really doubt that that many people in Czechia are actually interested in what CRI has to say. The same in Poland. I think that now CRI in Poland might have around 250,000 followers on Facebook, which compared to other popular media in Poland is a lot, is really a lot. Other most popular dailies actually have less following than that. So that's the first thing, that the reach, the outreach of these accounts is inflated by the usage of fake accounts. And then when it comes to the precise content, it's a really strange mixture, because on the one hand, we have a lot of, let's say, fun content, meaning beautiful pictures of Chinese landscapes and pandas and animals. Then we have some videos that are especially targeting local audiences because they're filmed in local languages. For example, about traveling. But where are these people traveling? They're traveling to Xinjiang, and they're only showing, for example, how great Xinjiang is as a place where you can, for example, try different kind of apples and pears, you know, and then they're showcasing national ethnic minorities as, you know, living this happy, peaceful life as if nothing else was happening there. So it might not be necessarily about directly countering the accusations of many members of the international community about the human rights violations in Xinjiang, but it's rather about painting an alternative picture of how great life actually is there according to the Chinese government. And also there is a odd addition of op-eds written either by anonymous authors or also by some members of the Polish public who are willing to publish and cooperate with the CRI. For example, about the perceived decline of Western civilization, especially of the US political system, of how bad the conditions are, socioeconomic conditions are in Western Europe or in the US, especially in the US. So these are things that are somehow intertwined with more light content, but nevertheless, they do carry quite a strong political message. And then it depends really on the readers and on the audience, whether they believe in this kind of a narrative or not, and what do they make out of it.
Yeah, Janis, please go ahead.
Well, I'd say to Jan's question that I think, you know, very strong disinformation we've seen on the pandemic and the origins question, and there's been quite a lot there, and very aggressively so. The other notion where I would say that, showing how bad the Western system is also some part of what I would call a disinformation effort, but in a way of exploiting inter-societal kind of fractures, in the way Russia does. I really haven't seen that at least in Europe for that matter. So I don't think we can, full scale kind of cross-compare, as I've said many times, the Russian and Chinese efforts in this area. And so there is disinformation, one area very strong, in other it's more generic and more interpretations of facts are being used, but clearly a strong narrative for probably showing comparative advantages to the audience of the Chinese system. But other than that, I haven't seen much more.
Yeah, that's definitely squares with what I've seen for Germany, for, I don't know, the UK, some other countries in Western Europe, where there's been a very strong focus on pandemic-related disinformation, especially on pandemic origins, where you can talk about straight up disinformation. But also to some extent, I think about vaccines and in ways promoting that Western vaccines kill the people, or it's like hyping up any deaths that are in relation to any that are claimed to be in relation to vaccines, even though they're not. And of course, the second strain that we've also seen strongly in Western Europe has been, since the refugee crisis, basically that Europe is descending into chaos. And that's often a spillover actually from what's happening in China. But then it does manifest itself in Europe as well. We do have more questions that I want to get to. And one is a question to Alicia and Janis. At the beginning of the panel, Janis argued that Chinese disinformation tools are emerging, but lack sophistication. Alicia says that China is using propaganda tools to polish Beijing's image, but that is not necessarily coercive yet. My question is, the person's question is, are both arguments compatible with each other, or are they actually contradictory? And how to untangle, basically how to establish what counts as sophisticated disinformation and what counts as crude, and how do you establish that?
Well, I think that these two arguments are not self-contradictory, because on the one hand, you can have a certain strategy, but the way you implement it is just another story. But I'm afraid that if we were to witness successful Chinese disinformation campaigns, then we would actually find out about it after it happened. So we wouldn't notice it at first. But also one aspect that to a certain extent, if we look at the last decade, could be seen as a success of Chinese information operations, is the whole narrative of China being, for many years, many people believed or somehow promoted this idea that China is an economic powerhouse, and that if you cooperate with China economically, you don't have to worry about the political implications of this kind of cooperation with an authoritarian government, because China only cares about business. And for many years, this kind of a belief was very widespread, and the whole engagement policy by both the US and Western Europe was to a certain extent based on this kind of an assumption that you can cooperate with China economically without worrying about the side effects of it. So here, if we look at the really long-term developments, I would say that Chinese officials and Chinese media, of course, they were doing it to a lesser extent, let's say 2 decades ago, but still there was this kind of a push to present China as a benign economic powerhouse.
I agree with Alicia there, that's where China has been successful. Therefore, I've many times pointed that the soft glows approach has been far more successful than the one that we've recently seen. And to an extent, one can argue, although you might disagree with the reasons for that and the end state, that might be quite a legitimate attempt by a country to portray itself in a specific light to others. But I would say that currently, clearly, the most efficient disinformation actor in Europe by far is Russia. And then there are some regional non-state actors, pretty well established here in Europe as well as in the United States, that do a decent job, if you might use this word, in the disinformation environment. And that's one of the reasons why China is very hard pressed, because there have been certain resiliences developed both within the societies as well as within the institutions to cope with these problems and challenges. And then when the actor that is not as sophisticated, it's, the tools are already preset to track it and see it. So as I've said, the one notion we haven't talked a lot about, where I think they're successful, but that is probably because of the large, comparatively small element, and that's Chinese diaspora. That is where I think China is still kind of very, very successful comparatively, and also probably spends a considerable amount of effort and time.
Yeah, and it's also more in terms of language. Often, a lot of the messaging is a lot better in Chinese than in most European languages, with perhaps the exception of English, but not always, I would say. We do have two more questions I want to ask before we go to our closing round of closing statements. One is to Alicia, whether you would be able to tell us a bit more about Chinese disinfo in other Visegrad 4 countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. It's been a big topic there. Are there any recent developments worth paying attention to, perhaps also in response to some of what's been happening in Budapest with some of the backlash against China's presence there and the role that the mayor has taken? And the other question is from me to Regis, whether, to the extent that you're able to speak about this, also about recent developments, have you seen an intensification of operations targeting Lithuania that would accompany the verbal, let's just say the verbal attacks on the country that are originating from the Chinese government? Alicia, do you want to go first?
Sure. So when it comes to similarities and differences in different V4 states, I would say that there are both certain trends that are very similar in all 4 countries, and quite a lot of political differences that are actually related to the domestic setup and the domestic dynamics of how these governments interact with China, or what kind of relations they have with the Chinese government at the moment. And this is of course changing because of the elections now in Czechia, also soon in Hungary. But overall, I would say that the dominant themes and tools are the same. So Chinese state-affiliated media like the CRI, the usage of social media, Chinese embassy being more and more active on social media. But then obviously because of, for example, Hungary being so close with the Chinese government, and also having actually, when it comes to the diaspora, it's country with the biggest Chinese diaspora among all V4 states, the local setup is very different there. And actually, it's quite interesting. The Map Influence project and our Hungarian analyst believes that if you compare Hungary to other countries in the region, there is less visible influence or less visible information attempts to influence the local public, probably because China feels that the official bilateral relations with the Hungarian government are so good that there is no need to invest in promoting certain messaging to the public. And then I wanted to say something else, but I forgot. Was there a second part of this question?
No, there's one question for you. If you remember it, you can integrate into your closing statement.
And that second question was related to me, I guess. Yes, and it will be a simple answer. Yes, we do observe and we are registering cyber incidents that are related to China-sponsored groups. I cannot disclose the more information, that only saying that it is targeting governmental system, and we investigate those cases very carefully. Why? Because this year Lithuania plans to open Taiwan embassy in Lithuania. So we're expecting, of course, the increase of this kind of attacks, and we are preparing ourselves really seriously to that, because, as I said previously, imagining the power that this country has in cyber weapons to be used, we expect that they will be used in large extent. So we'll see how we strengthen our abilities and protecting.
Whoop, unmuted. Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're coming to a close. We're approaching 2:30, but I do want to finish with one last question to all of the panelists as a sort of closing statement before we wrap up. And that is, what are the most important things that European countries need to do now to be better able to cope with both straight out information or those longer information operations looking forward? And perhaps we can go in reverse order, starting with Regis, then Alicia, and then Janis.
Yeah, sure. This ability to have cybersecurity center, or there is other models of incidents response teams that is de facto around the world standard to respond to cyber attacks, which reach it in our countries now the alarming stage. We should more invest in those technical teams and abilities to detect and then react to cyber attacks. That it's happening, and it's happening each day. So one thing. Another thing, it's why I stress it so much, those researches and investments, our European investments in R&D capabilities to investigate and solve the question that we are now heavily related to the Chinese manufactured internet devices and telecommunications equipment. We should research and develop our innovations in Europe and relate more on NATO standardized equipments more in the future. So that needs a strategy change. So maybe those two things that I would like to stress. Thanks.
Thank you. Alicia.
That's a very complex question, and I don't have a straight answer to that. I believe that the problem is much broader, and it's not limited to China only. So if we want to fight disinformation, we have to engage the society, and the society has to be interested in actually critically becoming critical consumers of the media, both traditional and online. And I think we have a really long way to go, given what has been happening also in Western social media with the tech giants and all the detrimental effects of how we're engaging with the online sphere. So I think that it should be both about investing in our resilience, but also investing in education and in engaging people at the grassroots level to actually want to be more critical in general about what's around us. And one thing that I forgot to add before, and I remembered what to look out for, the developments that are important now. I think that the Taiwan issue and Let's remember that right now we have a Taiwanese delegation and the Taiwanese Minister of Foreign Affairs visiting Slovakia and Czechia, and also going to Poland and to Brussels. And I think this is already attracting a lot of attention in the official Chinese media, with some more or less veiled threats against different countries. And probably in the nearest future, this will be the most important topic when it comes to Chinese efforts to silence certain people, certain groups, or to somehow twist the debate or create this perception of danger related to straightening ties with Taiwan.
Thank you. I think we're running 1 minute over. So Janis, you have the very short but last word.
Okay, so I'll have 3 points. First, we have to have a comprehensive approach to this problem, separating disinformation and information operations from cyber and influence operations in a more traditional way does not help. We have to look at it comprehensively as well as respond comprehensively. Second, we have to have much more of a long-term focus. I think we've always been stuck in a moment only, and really lacking that perspective. And I think also solutions for a long term is very important. And the last point is about avoiding giving too many leverages, especially relative to the key technologies of the future. I think that is something that should not be understated, should be always brought to the forefront, because I think that is quite clear that in these areas, we have to avoid being overly dependent, because if that will be so, there'll be big vulnerabilities that will be exposing us to the Chinese influence so many ways. Thank you.
Thank you. And that finishes our round today. On behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I want to thank all of our speakers, and of course, all of the audience for joining us here today. And with that, I will hand back to Michael for any last words. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, I just want to say thank you for a fascinating conversation. Really nothing else to add besides that, you know, we have focused on our part of Europe, and we'll be looking around some more, so please stay tuned. And again, thank you, Marika, for doing a wonderful job moderating the discussion. Thank you, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.